There is a man lying flat on his back in dry grass at the foot of a standing stone, and he is about to see something that nobody has seen for 3,500 years. It is the middle of a bright afternoon in July, in the year 1953. The turf on that chalk is going pale at the tips the way it always does by midsummer, because there is almost no soil up there and the rain runs straight through it. A warm wind is coming across the open plain, carrying the smell of cut hay and the faint sourness of sheep. Larks are going up one after another behind him and have been all afternoon, long enough that he has stopped hearing them. He has a heavy plate camera set on a short wooden tripod almost down in the grass, and he has been lying beside it for some time now, waiting, because he is photographing something rather dull. His name is Richard Atkinson, and he is one of the men directing the excavation on that hill. The trenches are opened where he says they are opened. The workmen take their instructions from him, and the barrels of chalk go where he points. He is photographing graffiti. Visitors have been cutting their names into these stones for centuries, with paint knives and chisels and whatever else came to hand, and some of that lettering is old enough to be interesting in its own right. Names from the 1600s and the 1700s, cut deep and square by people who had all afternoon. To photograph shallow marks on gray rock, you need the sun low and sideways, so that every scratch throws its own small shadow, and that is why he is lying down, and that is why he is waiting. The light comes round. The face of the stone lifts out of flatness the way a field does at the end of the day, and the names appear, and above the names, where there should be nothing but weathered sarsen, there is the clean outline of an axe head. Blade downward, a curved cutting edge, a narrow neck, the exact shape of a bronze axe of a kind that had gone out of use long before the Romans came. Beside it, another. Above that, another. Before the summer was out, they had gone over the standing stones properly in low light, and there were dozens of them. More than 50 on one stone alone, cut small and shallow and crowded together, all of them axes, all of them blade downward. On another stone there was a dagger with a drooping point, pecked into the rock at about the height of a person's chest. Nobody had ever noticed. Not the antiquarians who measured the place with chains, not the painters who sat in front of it for whole seasons, not the tens of thousands of people who had leaned their backs against that particular stone to get out of the wind and eat a sandwich. The marks had been there the entire time. They were simply too faint, and the light was almost never right. And nobody had thought to lie down in the grass. That is the thing about this hill, and it is the reason we are going to spend the next several hours on it. It has always had more in it than the people looking at it could see. Every generation that has walked up to those stones has been quite certain it understood them, and every generation has been holding about a third of the story. And the largest missing piece is not a secret and never was. It is simply this: the place we call Stonehenge was not built. It was built and then changed again, and then partly taken apart and set out differently, and then added to by people who had no memory of the ones before them, over a period longer than the whole span of history since. And then, at the end, it was left in the middle of a job. The very last thing anybody did there in prehistory was to dig 2 rings of holes in the chalk and put nothing in them and walk away. And those holes are still empty tonight. So we are going to walk the whole of it in order from long before there was a single stone standing on that ground to the winter afternoon in the middle of the last century when a crane lifted one of the fallen ones back up into the air. Every stage in the order it happened, with nothing skipped and nothing held back for later. Settle in now. Get yourself arranged in whatever way you already know works. The pillow where you like it, the covers at the weight you like them, 1 foot out if that is your habit. Let your shoulders go down off your ears. Let your hands go loose, palms open or curled. It does not matter which. Let your jaw come unstuck, because it is probably doing something it does not need to do. Let the small weight of the day go, the thing you meant to reply to, the drawer that still sticks, the conversation you have been rehearsing since 4:30. None of it improves for being carried into the dark, and all of it will still be findable in the morning, and most of it will have shrunk. You do not need to remember any of what follows. There will be a great many dates and a great many numbers in the next few hours, and not one of them is going to be asked of you. If you drift off in the middle of the Welsh hills and surface again somewhere among the Romans, you have not missed anything you needed. The story does not require you to hold the thread. That is my job, and I will keep hold of it whether you are here or not. This is not a test, and there is nothing at the end you have to arrive in time for. If you fall asleep in the first 10 minutes, that is the best possible outcome, and I will simply carry on talking to the room. There will be no music that swells and no sudden noises. My voice is going to stay exactly where it is, slow and level all the way through. If it helps you to think of it that way, imagine somebody sitting in a chair on the other side of a dark room, reading something long out loud. Not to you especially, just out loud, because the room is better with a voice in it. Now, the hill. It is in the south of England, on a broad rolling upland of chalk in the county of Wiltshire, about 8 miles north of the town of Salisbury. Chalk country has a particular feel to it that you will want in your mind for the next few hours. It is high, but never steep, all long shoulders and shallow dry valleys, with turf like a worn carpet laid straight over the rock. And no surface water anywhere, because chalk drinks rain the way a sponge does. The rivers, when you find them, run in flat green valleys well below the level of the downs, and everything, all the way through this story, happens either up on the open ground or down beside the water. The whole plain is white underneath. Cut through the turf anywhere on it, and you are into chalk within the depth of a spade, dazzling, powdery, soft enough to carve with a stick, and hard enough to hold a shape for 5,000 years. That single fact does more work in this story than anything else. It is why the ditches were dug at all. It is why they could be dug with the shoulder blade of a cow. It is why the first monument on that hill was blinding white and visible for miles, and it is why nearly every mark anybody has ever made up there is still legible from the air on a dry summer. And it is empty ground, in the sense that matters. Not empty of people, then or now, but open. No cliffs, no gorges, no natural theater. Nothing about the shape of that particular rise says anything at all. There are 10,000 places on the chalk that look exactly like it. Whatever made that one shoulder of grass matter enough for people to spend 1,500 years working on it was not the ground. It was the habit, and the habit started long before anybody thought about stone, before there was a monument, before there was a ditch, before anybody on that plain had ever seen a field. There was a deer. Start there, because the whole of what follows is only possible because of an animal that throws its tools away every spring. A red deer stag grows a new set of antlers every year of its adult life. They come up in the spring under a skin of velvet. They harden through the summer into something like ivory. They are carried and fought with through the autumn, and then, in the late winter or the early spring, the stag drops them, both of them usually within a day or two of each other, sometimes within minutes. They lie in the leaf litter where they fall. Mice and squirrels gnaw at them for the minerals, and for thousands of years, in the woods of southern England, people pick them up. An antler is a curved beam of dense bone with tines coming off it. Take the beam in both hands and drive a tine into soft rock, and it acts as a pick, a lever, and a wedge all at once. It is springy where flint is brittle. It can be resharpened by grinding. And on chalk it is very nearly a perfect tool, because chalk is a rock only in the sense that it is not soil, and a good antler will lever out lumps of it the size of a loaf. Every hole in this story, every ditch, every socket, every one of the thousands of tons of chalk moved on that hill across 15 centuries was dug out with shed antlers and shoveled with the shoulder blades of cattle and carried away in baskets. Nobody up there ever had a metal tool that would touch rock. They had bone, wood, leather, rope, and stone, and they had a very great deal of time. Now put the deer into the country it lived in. Long before there were farms in Britain, these islands were forest. Not the tidy woodland of a modern estate, but a continuous mixed wildwood running from one coast to the other, oak and lime and elm and hazel and pine, with open glades where fire or storm or grazing had knocked holes in it, and rivers running through it under overhanging trees. There were red deer and roe deer in it, and wild boar and beaver in every river, and aurochs, which were cattle the size of a small horse, with a spread of horn wider than a person is tall. There were wolves and lynx and bear. And there were people, though never very many at once, moving through it in small groups on foot, along the rivers and along the ridges, following the animals and the seasons and the fruiting of things. That is the world in which the story of this hill begins, and it begins beside water. A mile and a half or so from where the stones would eventually stand, down off the high ground in the valley of the river, there is a spring that comes out of the chalk at a steady warmth all year round. It does not freeze. On the coldest morning of the hardest winter there is green weed growing in it and steam coming off the surface, and the mud around it stays soft. To a group of people walking a frozen valley in January, a place where the water is open and the ground is not iron, is not a curiosity. It is the difference between staying and going. They stayed. Not permanently, and not all of them, but they came back to that spring for thousands of years, and they left an enormous amount of rubbish behind, which is the kindest thing anybody in prehistory can do for the people who come after. The mud there has preserved tens of thousands of pieces of worked flint. It has preserved burnt stone from cooking and charcoal from fires, and the bones of the animals they ate, and among those bones an extraordinary quantity of aurochs. One of those animals would feed a great many people at once. That is the profile of a gathering place, not a camp. Somewhere that groups converged on, killed something enormous, ate it together, and dispersed. And they were doing it early. The dates from that spring run back something like 10,000 years. And they keep going on and off for 4,000 years after that. Which means that when the first ditch was finally cut on the hill above, the practice of coming to that particular bend of that particular river was already older by a wide margin than the entire history of everything that has happened since. Up on the high ground above that valley, on the very rise where the stones would one day stand, at some point around 10,000 years ago, those people did something else. They dug 3 enormous pits in a rough line, and they set into them 3 pine trunks, stripped of their bark, each one about as thick through as a person and standing far higher than a house. They packed the sockets with chalk rubble and rammed it home. Later, somebody dug a 4th pit near them. Then, at some point, the posts either rotted where they stood or were taken down, and the holes silted up and the grass came over them, and that was that for 10,000 years until the 20th century put a car park on the site, and the machines found 3 dark round stains in the white chalk. We do not know what the posts were. That sentence is going to come up a great deal tonight, and I would rather say it plainly each time than dress it up. Nobody knows. They were set on a slight rise looking down toward the river. They were spaced without any obvious geometry, and they were made from the tallest straight timber available. They are the earliest thing anybody built on that plain. And they were standing there for centuries. Whatever they meant it to hunters who had never planted a seed and had no idea that farming existed anywhere in the world. Between the spring and the valley and the posts on the ridge, you have the whole of the argument for why the stones ended up where they did. It was not the geology, and it was not the view. It was that people had been coming to that stretch of country for 100 generations before anybody laid a stone on it, and a habit that old does not need a reason anymore. It is simply where you go. There is one more feature of that ground worth having in your mind before we let the farmers in, because it may be the strangest coincidence in the whole story, or it may be the entire explanation, and there is no way to settle it. Running across the turf on the slope below where the stones would eventually stand, there is a set of natural ridges and grooves in the chalk. They were cut by meltwater and frost in a much colder age long before any of these people existed. The way water and ice will crack and score a soft rock along its natural grain. They are shallow, they are perfectly straight, they run for a couple of 100 yards, and they are parallel. They are also, entirely by accident, lying along exactly the line that the sun takes on the 2 hinge days of the year on that latitude, rising at the height of midsummer at one end and setting at the depth of midwinter at the other. There is a real possibility that people walking that slope 10,000 years ago noticed that the ground itself was striped, and noticed at some point that the stripes and the sun agreed with one another and drew the obvious conclusion, which is that this particular hillside had been marked out by something other than people, and every single thing built on that hill afterwards for the next 5,000 years was built along that line. That is the run-up. A spring that does not freeze, a habit of gathering that is already ancient, 3 great posts on a ridge, and a set of accidental stripes in the grass pointing at the turning of the year, nothing yet that anybody would call a monument. And then, from across the water, a completely different way of living arrives, and everything on that plain changes inside a few generations. About 6,000 years ago, boats began arriving on the southern coast of these islands carrying things that had never been here before. They were not big boats. Hides stretched over a bent frame of timber or hollowed trunks lashed side by side, low in the water and steered with paddles, crossing from the near coast of the continent on a calm day with the tide right. What they carried was the entire package at once, and this is the part that still surprises people. Not a slow drift of ideas. Cattle standing braced on the boards with their legs tied. Sheep, which are not native to Britain and have never been native to Britain and had to be carried here, every single one of them, animal by animal, in an open boat. Pigs, sacks of grain, wheat and barley, seed corn that had been bred in the warm valleys of the Near East and had walked across a continent over the previous 2,000 years in the hands of farmers. Pottery and the knowledge of how to use all of it. Within a few centuries, the wildwood was in trouble, not gone, but opened in patches with axes. And this is where the flint comes in, because a farmer clearing woodland needs a great many axe heads. And a flint axe head, properly ground and polished and hafted into a wooden handle, will take down a mature tree with surprising speed and then blunt itself and need replacing. The flint that lies loose on the surface of chalk country is weathered and full of hidden cracks. The good stuff, the black glassy flint that flakes exactly where you want it to, lies in seams deep inside the chalk. So people dug for it. They sank shafts into the downs, some of them 30 or 40 feet deep, straight down through solid rock, and at the bottom they drove galleries sideways along the seam. Down there, in the dark, by the light of little lamps of hollowed chalk, with animal fat and a rush wick burning in them, adults lay on their sides in a space too low to kneel in and prized out nodules of flint with red deer antler. And the nodules went up in baskets on ropes, and the chalk waste went back down the shafts behind them. There are mines in the south of England where you can still see the sooty smudge of a lamp on the wall and the marks of the antler tines in the chalk, and in a few of them an antler pick left lying exactly where it was set down when the gallery was worked out. That is the mentality arriving on the plain, and you need it, because everything that happens on this hill afterwards depends on it. These were people entirely prepared to spend an enormous amount of collective effort digging a hole for reasons that were not, in any narrow sense, immediately practical. The first thing they built on the chalk was for the dead. Long barrows started going up across southern England soon after the farming did, and there are dozens within a walk of our hill. A long barrow is an elongated mound, often more than 80 paces from end to end, higher and broader at one end than the other, made of chalk rubble quarried out of a ditch cut along either side of it. When it was new, it was not the soft green whaleback you see today. It was blinding. Raw chalk under an open sky, visible for miles, a white line laid across a green ridge. At the broad end there was usually a chamber, sometimes of timber, sometimes of great stone slabs set on end, with a low doorway between them, and that chamber is where the bones went. And here is the thing about them that no amount of familiarity ever quite softens. They are not graves in the sense we mean. The bones inside are almost never whole people laid out. They are sorted. Skulls in one place, long bones stacked in another, ribs and small bones swept into corners, individuals mixed together until there are no individuals left. Only a community reduced to its parts and arranged. Bodies seem to have been left somewhere else first, exposed until the flesh was gone, and then the clean bones were brought in and added to the pile. And the chamber was not sealed and forgotten. It was opened again and again and again over generations, and bones were taken out as well as put in and moved about and sometimes carried away entirely. So from the very beginning on this plain, the dead are not put away. They are kept, handled, reorganized, and used. Hold on to that, because in about 1,000 years it is going to explain the first version of Stonehenge completely. Alongside the barrows came the gathering places. Causewayed enclosures are the first monuments in Britain built for crowds. Take a hilltop, cut a ring of ditch round it, but cut the ditch in short lengths with gaps of undug ground between them, so that the whole ring is more like a dotted line than a boundary. There is one a few miles from our hill on a low rise, and it is a big one. What went on inside them is a genuine puzzle, but the rubbish is very suggestive. Enormous quantities of animal bone, particularly cattle, broken pottery, and human remains again. The picture that most people settle on is a place where scattered farming households came together once or twice a year, killed and ate a great deal of beef, made and broke alliances, handed over cattle, arranged marriages, and dealt with their dead. Everything a society needs to do that it cannot do while everyone is living half a day apart. And then, about 5,500 years ago, somebody on our plane built something that changes the scale of the whole story. Running east to west across the ground a few hundred yards north of where the stones would eventually stand, they cut 2 parallel ditches and threw the chalk up into 2 parallel banks, and they kept going, a little under 2 miles from end to end. 250 feet or so apart, closed off at both ends. The ground it crosses is not flat, so from inside it you cannot see from one end to the other. You walk along it, and the horizon in front of you is the bank, and then the sky, and then more of it. It ignores the landscape entirely. It ignores a dry valley in its way. It simply goes. Nobody knows what it was for. It is far too long to be an enclosure and far too close to be a road. The best that can be said is that it is a formal shape laid on the land at a scale that no single family could have made and no single person could have seen, and that at its eastern end it points at a long barrow that was already old when it was built. To make it, people cut the better part of 2 miles of ditch twice over through solid chalk with antler. That is the plain in the centuries before the first ditch on our hill. Not empty ground waiting for a monument. Crowded ground. White barrows on every ridge with the sorted bones of grandparents inside them, a gathering enclosure on a hill nearby, an enormous double bank striding across the middle of everything, the spring in the valley still being used as it had been used for 5,000 years already, and a scatter of small farmsteads in the low ground with their cattle and their little square plots of wheat. And then, about 5,000 years ago, on that one particular shoulder of grass, somebody picked up an antler and started a hole. The first Stonehenge had no stone circle in it at all. It is worth sitting with that for a moment, because almost everybody carries a picture in their head of the ring of uprights and lintels. And that ring does not exist yet and will not exist for another 500 years. What they made about 5,000 years ago was a ring cut into the ground. They marked out a circle about 360 feet from one side to the other, which is roughly the length of a football pitch, and around that line they dug a ditch, not a neat engineered trench. If you look at the sections that have been excavated, the ditch is a series of deep oval pits, dug separately and then broken through into one another to make a continuous channel, and the depth wanders from 3 feet to 7 feet along its length, and the width wanders too. It was dug by a lot of small groups working next to each other, each with their own idea of how deep was deep enough. And nobody went round afterwards to tidy it up. They dug it with antler. There is no argument about this. Antler picks were left in the ditch bottom in numbers, some of them worn down to stumps, some of them barely used, laid in place deliberately at the end of the work, and it is those antlers lying where they were put down by people whose names nobody will ever know that give us the date. The radiocarbon runs on them are the reason we can say 5,000 years and mean it. Every basket of chalk that came out of that ditch went up onto a bank on the inside of it. That bank, when it was new, stood perhaps 6 feet high, and it was made of nothing but broken white chalk fresh out of the ground. There was no grass on it, no soil, no weathering. On a bright day, it would have been painful to look at. From the low ground, it would have read as a white ring drawn on a green hill, and from a mile off you would have seen it as a line of light. Inside the bank, close in against it, they dug 56 holes in a ring. Those pits are the strangest and most important thing on the site, and they are also completely invisible today. Each one is a few feet across and a few feet deep with a flat bottom, and they are set out around the circle with real care, far more evenly spaced than the ditch is dug. Something stood in some of them, at least for a time, because the chalk in the sides is crushed and there is packing rubble in the bottoms. Whether that something was timber post or small standing stones is one of the longest-running arguments in British archaeology, and it has not been settled, and it may never be, because the pits were emptied and refilled repeatedly. What went into them afterwards is not in doubt at all. Burnt bone. For something like 500 years, this white ring on the chalk was a cemetery, and the largest one of its date known anywhere in these islands. Bodies were burned somewhere else, and the clean burnt bone was brought here in bundles and put into the pits and into the ditch and into the bank. Not everybody who died on that plain plainly. The estimates run to somewhere between 150 and 240 people across 5 centuries, which is a handful of individuals per generation out of a population of thousands. These were selected dead, men and women both, and some children, so it is not a warrior class and not a single family line, but it is a small, chosen fraction, and a good many of them had not grown up there. The chemistry of a person's teeth records the water and the rock of wherever they spent their childhood, because you drink it and eat off it and build your own skeleton out of it, and the enamel then locks that signature in for good. When the burnt bone from those pits was tested, a large share of it carried a signature from the far west, from country with entirely different rock underneath it, from Wales. Sit with that for a moment before we go on, because it is going to matter enormously in 100 years of this story. Long before a single Welsh stone was dragged onto that plain, Welsh people were being carried onto it, dead, in bags, and buried in a white ring on a hill. Around the outside of the ring, they left gaps in the ditch, and through the main gap out to the northeast. Along the line of those natural stripes in the chalk, they set up a great rough boulder of sarsen sandstone. It was never dressed or shaped. It leans now, and it leaned in the 1700s when people first started drawing it, and it stands alone out beyond the ring like something left behind by the builders. It is the one stone on the site that everybody has always been able to see from the road. And what did all this look like on a normal day in the centuries when it was in use? Quieter than you would think. A white ring on an open hill with a shallow ditch outside it and a ring of posts or small stones inside. Grass beginning to creep up the bank after the first few decades, and somebody perhaps scraping it back. Cattle grazing right up to the ditch, the great double bank striding across the ground to the north, barrows on the skyline, smoke somewhere down in the valley, and a few times a year people coming up the slope in numbers with something small and heavy wrapped in cloth, and a hole being opened, and something being put in it, and the hole being closed. That is the first monument, and it stands like that more or less unchanged for 500 years, longer than the whole span from the reign of Henry VIII to tonight. 20 generations of people for whom Stonehenge was a white earth ring where the ashes of certain dead were kept, and who would not have recognized a single element of what the place became afterwards. Then, around 4,500 years ago, in the space of perhaps 2 or 3 lifetimes, everything about it changed. The ring stopped being a cemetery. The old pits were emptied and packed and forgotten. And onto that hill, from 2 entirely different directions, came stone. This is where the story stops being about one community and starts being about most of a country. And to understand why the first of those stones was worth what it cost, we have to leave the plain altogether and go about 150 miles west into the hills at the far end of Wales, where the rock comes out of the ground already shaped like a monument. At the western end of Wales, there is a range of low, rough hills that come up out of farmland like a set of knuckles. They are not high. You could walk over the whole range in a day. But the tops are broken into crags of dark rock, and those crags do something unusual. They split themselves into pillars. The rock is volcanic, laid down and squeezed and cooled in a way that left it shot through with vertical joints. And when frost and rain get into those joints over enough centuries, the crag begins to come apart into tall, narrow, roughly rectangular columns standing side by side against the hillside like books left on a shelf when the rest have been taken away. Some of them are spotted, pale flecks scattered through a blue-gray ground, so that a wet one looks like the sky through leaves. Locally, and in this story, all of the stone brought from those hills goes by one name: the Bluestones. You do not have to imagine anybody inventing the idea of a standing stone up there. The hillside is already full of them, standing upright, made by weather. All anybody had to do was notice that the hill was giving away pillars, and that a pillar could be taken somewhere else. They took a great many. Over the past decade or so, 2 of those crags have been excavated properly, and what came out of the ground settles the question of how the Bluestones left Wales in a way that nothing before it did. At the foot of each crag there is a platform of dry stacked stone, built out from the rock face by hand, level, and positioned exactly where a pillar, being eased off the cliff, would land. Above it, there are gaps in the outcrop, empty sockets with the stumps of pillars still in place at their bases, and the raw, unweathered scars where a column was taken. Wedges were left behind in the joints, and they are wedges of soft stone, deliberately chosen, because a soft wedge crushes and spreads as it is hammered and pushes the joint apart along its whole length, where a hard one would concentrate everything on one spot and crack the pillar you are trying to take. In the silt on the platforms there is charcoal from the fires the quarrymen sat at, and hazelnut shells, and that charcoal gives dates. The quarrying was going on in the centuries just before the Bluestones appear on the plain in England, so they were not carried to Wiltshire by ice. That was the tidy explanation for a long time, and it is a reasonable thing to have believed, because glaciers do move rock and dump it hundreds of miles from home. But no glacier ever built a level stone platform under a cliff or left a fire and a scatter of nutshells beside it. People went up a Welsh hillside with mallets, ropes, and wedges of soft stone, worked pillars loose from a crag, and lowered them onto that platform to be tipped onto sledges. That is the answer, and the ground gives it plainly. And then there is the other discovery, which is stranger and more human than any of it. A few miles from those crags, on a bare moor, there are 4 standing stones in an ark. They have been known for a long time and nobody thought much of them, because 4 stones is not a circle. But when the turf around them was stripped, the sockets of the missing ones turned up. And the ark turns out to have been a full ring, a large one, of the same diameter as the ditched circle back on the plain. Most of its stones were pulled out and taken away, and the holes were left. And in one of those empty sockets, the base impression matches, in cross-section, the odd 5-sided profile of one particular blue stone standing at Stonehenge today, which suggests something that is very hard to prove and very difficult to forget, that at least part of what was carried across southern Britain was not raw material at all. It was a monument that already existed, taken down, carried, and put back up on somebody else's hill. The distance is 150 miles as a bird would fly it, and half as far again for anything that has to keep to the ground and go round estuaries and up river valleys. There were something like 80 of these stones brought over, of which 43 are still on the site. Each one weighs between 1 and 4 tons. That is not a boulder. That is the weight of a loaded cart, in a shape that will not roll, that has no handholds. And that will crack if you drop it wrong. How they were moved is the part where honesty is required, because nobody knows. There are only a few real options, and each has a difficulty. Rafts along the coast and up the rivers is the old favorite, and the sea route round the toe of Wales is genuinely nasty water. There is a modern attempt, with a replica boat and a real bluestone. That ended with the stone on the seabed. An overland haul on sledges over rollers or over a laid track of timber is slow, needs a wide corridor cleared through wooded country, and needs feeding, but it needs nothing that these people did not have. A mixture of both is likely. Whichever it was not one heroic journey. It was decades of journeys, a stone or 2 at a time, done by people who had made the arrangement into a routine. But the question that sits underneath all of it is not how, it is why. There is perfectly good hard stone in southern England. There are enormous sandstone boulders lying loose on the downs 15 miles to the north of the site, a long day's walk for a man carrying nothing. And they are bigger and harder and better than anything in West Wales. Why would anybody drag 80 pillars the width of a country when there was better material sitting free on the grass within sight of the hill? The answer cannot be practical, so it has to be about where the stone came from. Something about that particular hillside mattered. Perhaps a spring on it, perhaps a story about it, perhaps ancestors buried in it. And here is where the burnt bone in the 56 pits comes back, because we know that people who had grown up on Welsh rock were already being carried to that hill in England and buried there in the centuries before the stones arrived. Bodies first, then stones. Whatever the connection was between the far west of Wales and this shoulder of chalk, it was old, it was maintained across generations, and it was worth a great deal of effort to keep. So the blue stones come over years in 1s and 2s up out of the valleys and onto the plain, and they are set up. And this is where the habit of this place shows itself for the first time, because we do not actually know where they were set up first. There are holes on the site in a double arc that look like the sockets of a bluestone setting that was begun and abandoned unfinished. Somewhere between 2 and 4 times in the next 1,000 years, every one of those stones will be pulled up and moved and put somewhere else. And the ones we can see today are standing in the last arrangement anybody bothered to leave them in. And while the blue stones are still arriving, the same people or their children look north to the high downs and decide to do something that makes the Welsh Hall look like a rehearsal. 15 miles to the north of the hill, a long day's walk for a man carrying nothing. The chalk rises into a higher, wilder country of long grass ridges and hanging woods, and lying about on the floors of the dry valleys up there, in their thousands, are the sarsens. A sarsen is a lump of sandstone, but not the kind that comes in beds you can quarry. Tens of millions of years ago, that whole country was under a layer of sand. And in places the water moving through it dissolved silica out of the grains and cemented them back together again into a rock harder than concrete. Then the sand around the hard patches washed away over an unimaginably long time and left the patches behind, lying loose on the surface in slabs and blocks and lumps, some the size of a table and some the size of a garden shed. Where a valley is full of them, half sunk in the turf and scattered at random, the local name for them for hundreds of years has been the gray weathers, because from a distance, on a gray day, a valley floor covered in them looks exactly like a flock of sheep lying down. For a long time, nobody could say which of those valleys the Stonehenge sarsens came from, because sarsen is sarsen, and one gray lump looks like another. Then somebody worked out that the trace elements locked inside the rock differ slightly from one patch of country to the next, like a fingerprint, and that there happened to be a core sample drilled out of one of the stones in the 1950s, which had been taken away by a workman and kept on a wall in another country for half a century before it was handed back. When that core was tested against samples from every sarsen field in southern England, all but 2 of the great stones on the site matched one wood on the high downs to the north, not the general area. One wood. So somebody stood in that wood among a valley floor of gray weathers and chose, not the biggest ones necessarily, but the flattest and the straightest and the ones with the fewest hidden faults, and they chose the better part of 80 of them, and then they had to get them home. Take the measure of one. An average upright from the outer ring stands about 13 feet out of the grass, with another 4 or 5 feet of it buried, and weighs in the region of 25 tons. The great ones from the inner setting are far worse. The largest upright on the site stands 22 feet above ground, with 8 more feet of it under the turf, 30 feet of stone in all, and weighs something close to 40 tons, which is about the weight of a loaded railway wagon. These are objects that no arrangement of rope and muscle should be able to move at all. And they moved every one of them, 15 miles, down off the high downs across a river valley and up a long, shallow gradient onto the plain, with nothing but timber, rope, grease, water, food, and an enormous number of people. The mechanics are not mysterious, only relentless. A stone is levered up at one end with timber balks, and packing is slid underneath, and then the other end, and so on until it is high enough to get a sledge under it. The sledge is a raft of heavy squared timbers, and the stone is lashed to it with rope of twisted bast, the inner bark of lime trees, which is strong, does not stretch much, and can be made in any quantity by anybody sitting down for the evening. Then the sledge is either dragged over a laid track of round timber rollers, which have to be carried from the back to the front continuously by 2 people who never get to stop, or hauled along a pair of greased timber rails, which some modern experiments say works better on soft going and is certainly less fiddly. Then people pull. The estimates vary with the assumptions, but for the biggest stones, you are looking at somewhere between 100 and 200 adults on the ropes at once, in two teams, with more ahead clearing and laying the track, more behind moving rollers, and more again carrying water and food up and down the line. A day's progress might be a mile on good going and much less on bad. There is at least one place on the likely route where the ground falls into a valley and rises out of it again, and everybody who has ever tried to model that stretch has come to the same conclusion, which is that the descent is worse than the climb, because a 40-ton stone on a grease slope is a thing that wants very badly to go faster than the people holding it. And all of that is only the transport. It gets the stone to the edge of the site and no further. The dressing was the real labor. If you have only ever seen photographs, you may not know that these stones are shaped, not roughly knocked about, shaped over their entire surface on the faces that show. The natural sarsen block that came off the downs was lumpy and irregular and covered in a hard crust. And what stands on that hill is a set of parallel-sided slabs with flat faces and squared edges, and a slight swell in the middle of the tall ones like the columns of a classical temple, which is a trick to stop them looking pinched when you see them from below. The tool for that was another sarsen. Round hammer stones, some of them the size of an orange and some the size of a football, thousands of which have been dug out of the ground on the site, worn round and battered. You hold one in both hands and you strike the face of the standing stone, and a small crust of rock the size of a coin flies off, and you do it again. There is an estimate worked out from the volume of stone removed and the rate at which a person can swing of something like 20 million blows to dress the sarsens on that site. Somebody has to make the food while that is happening. Somebody has to keep the cattle. This is not a project. It is an economy. The debris makes the picture complete. There is a layer of sarsen chippings in the ground all round the stones, tiny sharp flakes, thick enough in places to be a proper deposit, and the working of the stone was clearly done on the spot, in the open, over years, with the half-finished uprights lying about on the grass. For a generation, that hill was not a sacred, silent ring. It was a yard. It rang. You would have heard it from the valley all day, a hard, flat knocking coming down on the wind from the top of the slope, hundreds of people at it, and dust on everything, and the grass killed for 100 yards around, and the whole of it from a distance looking like a mess. Then they started raising them, and the mess turned into the thing everybody in the world can draw from memory. To stand a 30-foot stone up in the ground, you first have to dig it a bed, and the bed has to be a particular shape. They cut a pit deep enough to swallow a quarter of the stone, and they cut 3 of its sides straight down, and the 4th side they left has a long ramp sloping up to the surface. On the vertical side, opposite the ramp, they drove stakes into the chalk to make a back wall, so that the foot of the stone would bite instead of skidding. Then the stone came in on its sledge, foot first, and the foot went down the ramp. Once the base was over the hole and the stone was tipped past a certain angle, gravity did some of the work and became a serious problem for the rest of it. The far end was raised with levers and cribbing, timber laid in layers under the rising stone so that nothing could ever come back down, and ropes went over an A-frame of heavy timber set beside the hole, and the teams pulled. The stone came up the last of the way, dropped its foot against the stakes, and stood leaning slightly in a hole considerably wider than itself. Then came the fiddling, getting it plumb, packing the gap all round with ram chalk and sarsen chippings and flint, wedging it, checking it, adjusting, packing again. There are sockets on the site where you can see the packing has been dug out and replaced, which is somebody standing back on the grass, looking up, deciding it was not right, and doing it again. Now for the extraordinary part. They did not stop at uprights. Around the outside, they built a ring of 30 of them, evenly spaced, with a gap of about a yard between each pair. And on top of that ring, they laid 30 lintels, end to end, all the way round, so that the whole circle was closed at the top by a continuous band of stone 13 feet up in the air. There is nothing else like it in the prehistoric architecture of these islands. Standing stones are everywhere. A closed ring of horizontal stone carried on uprights, level all the way round, is unique to this one hill. And it is level. The ground it stands on is not. It falls away noticeably to one side. The builders lengthened the uprights on the low side and shortened them on the high side, and set them at different depths, so that the tops all finished within a few inches of the same height, and the ring of lintels runs true. Anyone who has hung a shelf with a spirit level and a pencil will understand exactly how satisfying and how annoying that job was. The lintels themselves are not simple slabs. Each one is curved on plan, so that the 30 of them together make a circle rather than a 30-sided figure. Each one is jointed to the uprights beneath it with a mortise and tenon, exactly as a carpenter joints wood. A knob of stone left standing proud on the top of each upright, and a corresponding hollow cut into the underside of the lintel to drop over it. And each lintel is jointed to its neighbors along the ring with a tongue and groove, a ridge down one end face and a matching channel down the other, so that the whole band locks together into one hoop. Those are woodworking joints. Nobody cuts a mortise and tenon in stone because stone requires it. Stone requires weight and friction and nothing else. They cut them because the people who designed this thing came from a world built out of timber, and they had been making round buildings of posts and rings of beams all their lives, and when they finally worked in the hardest material available, they built it the way they knew how. Stonehenge is a timber building executed in rock. That is why it looks like nothing else, and it is also why, when you stand under a lintel today, it feels less like a monument and more like a room. Inside the ring they put the real thing. 5 pairs of the largest stones on the site, each pair carrying its own single lintel, and each pair standing separate from its neighbors, 5 great free-standing doorways. Arranged not in a circle but in a horseshoe, open at one end and closed at the other. They are graded. The lowest pair stands at the open end, the next pair higher, and the tallest of the 5 closes the horseshoe at the far end, 22 feet of stone above the grass with 8 feet more of it buried and its lintel laid across the top of that. The gap between those 2 tallest uprights is narrow. Standing at the open end of the horseshoe and looking down the length of it, you look through the whole setting and out through that slot, and the slot frames a specific piece of sky. Getting a lintel of 10 tons up 13 feet or up 22 feet for the great pair was the last problem and the most argued about. The likeliest method, and the one that has been tested at full scale with volunteers and worked, is the crib. You lay 2 heavy timbers on the ground either side of the fallen lintel, lever one end of the stone up a few inches, slide a timber under it crossways, let it down, do the other end, and repeat. The stone rises on a growing tower of stacked logs a few inches at a time. And it takes a long while, and it is completely safe as long as nobody hurries, and eventually the crib is as high as the uprights, and the stone is levered sideways off the top of it and lowered onto the waiting tenants. The alternative, a long earth or timber ramp, built up the outside, needs a colossal amount of material and leaves traces that have not been found. What is not in doubt is the fit. The mortises and tenons on those stones are cut to sit together, and to cut them you have to know, before the lintel goes up, exactly where the knobs on the uprights have ended up after all that packing and plumbing, and transfer those positions to the underside of a 10-ton slab lying on the grass, and then peck out the hollows in the right places with a hammerstone and get it right. Because there is no adjusting anything once it is up there. Somebody measured, somebody made marks, somebody was responsible, and when it was finished, this is what stood on the hill. An outer ring of 30 uprights closed by a continuous hoop of lintels. Inside that, a ring of the small dark Welsh bluestones. Inside that, the horseshoe of 5 great doorways, with the tallest at its closed end. Inside that again, an oval or a horseshoe of more bluestones. A flat slab of greenish-gray sandstone lying at the heart of it, of which more later. Out beyond the entrance, the old leaning boulders standing alone in the grass, all of it fresh, unweathered, and pale, because dressed sarsen when it is new is not the mottled gray-green of the photographs, it is the color of bone. And the whole thing would have shown. 75 great stones in the ring and the horseshoe, with a handful of others set up outside them, brought 15 miles and raised in the space of a couple of generations, on top of a ring of Welsh pillars that had already been dragged 150 miles, on top of a weight chalk ring already 500 years old. And the thing that whole assembly was aimed at was not the summer at all. Everything on that hill lies along one line, and it is the same line as the accidental stripes in the chalk. The entrance gap in the old ditch is on it, the leaning outlying boulder is near it, the open end of the great horseshoe faces along it, and the axis runs from the northeast to the southwest. Straight through the middle of the ring and out the other side. A line like that gives you 2 events a year, at opposite ends 6 months apart. At the northeast end, on the longest day, the sun comes up. At the southwest end, on the shortest day, the sun goes down. Both of those happen on the same axis. They are the same alignment seen from either end. And for about 300 years now, the popular imagination has fixed on the sunrise, because sunrise is easier to photograph and because the crowds go at midsummer. The builders, as far as anyone can tell, were far more interested in the other end of it. Before we take the winter view, 2 small points about the accuracy of the thing, because people either overstate it or dismiss it, and both are a shame. The first is that the alignment is good, but it is not an instrument. The axis is laid on the solstice within about a degree, which is very respectable for people working with rope and sight lines and no writing, and it is far too close to be an accident, particularly when you remember that the natural stripes in the chalk were already lying along it. But it is not accurate enough to be a calendar in the modern sense. You cannot stand there and read off the date. What you can do is stand there on the right afternoon and see the sun arrive where the building says it should arrive, which is a different sort of instrument altogether. And probably the point. The second is that the sky has moved. The tilt of the earth wobbles very slowly over tens of thousands of years, and the angle at which the sun rises and sets at the solstice on that latitude has drifted a little since the stones went up. Not much, under a degree. But it means that the sunset the builders saw was not in exactly the place that a sunset stands today. And it means that anybody insisting on the alignment to the width of a finger is measuring against the wrong sky. There is also the leaning boulder out beyond the entrance, which everybody expects to be the marker for the midsummer sunrise, and which in fact sits a little to one side of the line. It probably had a partner once. There is a hole beside it of about the right size, emptied long ago. If two stones stood there, then the sunrise came up between them, and nobody would ever have thought of it as a pointer at all. Another gap that no longer exists. Picture what they made as it stood when it was complete, and take the winter view. You come up the slope from the northeast on the shortest afternoon of the year, through the entrance gap along the axis, and in front of you is the open mouth of the horseshoe with the 5 great doorways rising away from you, low, higher, higher, to the tallest pair closing the far end. Beyond them is the sky. And as the sun drops, it settles into the narrow slot between those 2 tallest uprights, sits there for a few minutes with the whole slot burning, and goes down through it, and the light comes back at you along the axis and lies out over the grass in a long, bright bar. That is what the setting was built to do, and that is the view the people who dragged the stones intended. It is important to be plain about this, because that is the ancient view and not tonight's. That tallest pair no longer stands as a pair. At some time, nobody wrote down, the second of the 2 uprights came down and brought its lintel with it, and both of them lie in the grass at the foot of the survivor, the upright cracked across and half buried, the lintel resting on top of the wreck. What is left standing is one enormous single stone, the tallest on the site, leaning very slightly with nothing beside it. The slot is gone. Go up there on the shortest day now, and the sun does not drop through a gap. It goes down past the open flank of the one that is left, and the bar of light falls a little to the side of where it used to fall. Every photograph you have ever seen of a midwinter sun standing in a stone doorway on that hill was taken through one of the other openings, or made with a lens and a good deal of hope. The original event, as designed, has not been visible to anybody for a very long time. So, why midwinter? Why build the largest stone structure in the country to point at the end of the shortest day? Partly because of what midwinter is, in a farming year, in a cold place, before storage was reliable. It is the hinge. It is the day after which the light comes back. It is also, and this is the practical half of it, the moment in the year when there is more food available than at any other. Because you cannot feed every animal through the winter, and so a good many of them are killed in late autumn and early winter, and the meat has to be eaten before it spoils. Midwinter in a prehistoric farming society is not a lean time. It is the feast. And we know it was a feast here because of the pigs. 2 miles from the stones, beside the river, there was a settlement, and the rubbish from it has been dug and sieved and studied more thoroughly than almost any other prehistoric rubbish in Europe. It is stuffed with animal bone, and the animal bone is overwhelmingly pig. Enormous numbers of them. And when you look at the teeth of a young pig, you can read the season it died in, because pigs are born at a predictable time of year, and their teeth come through on a schedule. The great majority of those animals were killed at around 9 months old, which puts the killing squarely in the winter. Better than that, many of the bones have arrowheads in them, or the marks of arrowheads. Animals shot rather than cleanly slaughtered, which does not read as farmyard butchery at all. It reads as a hunt staged for a crowd, animals turned loose and brought down in front of people who had come a long way to watch. And they had come a very long way. The chemistry of those pig bones and of the cattle bones with them, records where the animals were raised, and they were raised everywhere. Not locally, not even regionally. Animals from the west of England, from Wales, from the north, from Scotland. People were bringing livestock to that valley on the hoof from the far ends of Britain, walking them for weeks in the late autumn to be killed and eaten there in the darkest part of the year. There is nothing else like that anywhere in the prehistory of these islands. Whatever was happening on that plain at midwinter, most of a country came to it. Which turns the picture around entirely. We are used to imagining a small band of specialists at Stonehenge, robed and secretive, and the truth, as far as the ground can tell us, is closer to the largest gathering anybody in Britain had ever seen. Thousands of people camped in the valley in the cold, herds arriving. Fires, meat, and a great deal of noise, and then, at a particular hour, on a particular afternoon, everybody going up the slope in the failing light to watch the sun go down through a gap in the stones. And they had somewhere else to do it from, which is the piece of this that nobody suspected until the last 20 years or so, and which changes the shape of the whole story. 2 miles northeast of the stones, on a slope running down to the river, there is a great bowl of ground with a bank round it. It is so large that for a long time nobody paid it much attention, because you cannot see the shape of it from inside, and it does not look like anything from the road. It is 1/4 of a mile across. It is the largest enclosure of its kind in Britain, and underneath it, sealed and preserved, are the floors of houses. They are small, square buildings about 15 feet each way, with walls of wattle and daub on a timber frame and a roof of thatch or turf. The floor is chalk, beaten and rammed until it is as hard and as smooth as a modern kitchen floor and almost white. In the middle of each one there is an oval hearth, burnt orange and cracked from years of fire. Around the hearth, the chalk is worn into a hollow where people sat and knelt. Against the walls there are slots and stake holes in patterns that match the stone furniture found in houses of the same date in the far north of Scotland, which means beds down each side and a dresser opposite the door. And if you have ever stood in one of those northern houses, you can put the furniture back into these ones in your head without straining. The floors are stuffed with rubbish trodden into them: flint chips, potsherds, burnt bone, hazelnut shells. In some houses the chalk is greasy with cooking fat. In others it is not, and those clean ones tend to sit apart inside their own little fenced yards, and what that difference means is anybody's guess. There were a great many of these houses. The excavated sample is small and the extrapolation is uncertain, but the estimates run to several hundred and possibly to 1,000 or more. That would make it, briefly, the largest settlement anybody had built in northern Europe, and the striking thing is how briefly. The rubbish shows no sign of long, steady occupation. There is no build-up of the sort you get in a village lived in for centuries. It looks like a place that filled up and emptied out again, over and over, for a few decades, at the same time that the Sarsens were being raised on the hill. That is a builder's camp and a pilgrim's camp, and they may well have been the same people. Inside that enclosure and facing the river, there was a monument of its own, a great setting of enormous timber posts and concentric rings, rebuilt more than once, with an entrance passage and a facade. There is another one on the ridge just outside it, which stood as a set of concrete markers in a field for most of the last century, and is one of the quietest places on the whole plain. And the alignment of the big timber setting at the settlement is the thing that makes the hair go up. The stone circle on the hill faces the midwinter sunset. The timber circle by the river faces the midwinter sunrise. Same day, opposite ends of it. And between the two of them, there is a road at each end. From the timber circle, a short, broad avenue of rammed flint, worn hollow by feet, runs straight down the slope to the water. And from the river, on the other side of a bend, another avenue of banks and ditches runs up onto the plain, turns, and comes at the stone circle from the northeast straight along the axis, so that the last stretch of the approach is the alignment itself. The two avenues do not meet each other. They both meet the river. So the reading that fits, and it is a reading and not a fact, is a procession that took a night. Midwinter sunrise at the timber circle among the houses, in the noise and the smoke and the meat where everything is made of wood and everything is alive. Then, at some point down the flint road to the river and along the water and up the other avenue. Out of the settlement and onto the empty high ground, arriving at the stones as the light goes, where everything is made of stone and nothing changes, and the burnt bone of the ancestors is in the ground under your feet. Wood for the living, stone for the dead, and a river between them. That may be entirely wrong. It rests on a set of alignments and two roads that both end at water. And the people who proposed it would be the first to say so. But something on that scale was happening because most of a country was walking pigs across it in December. There is one more thing about the river worth saying while we are down here, which is that the Welsh stones did not necessarily arrive on the hill first. At the point where the Second Avenue meets the water there is a circular setting of holes, and they are the right size and shape to have held bluestones, and they are packed and worn as if stones stood in them for a while and were then taken out. Which would mean that when the first pillars came up out of the west, they were set up at the landing place, by the river, and stood there for years or generations, and were only later taken down again and carried the last mile and a half up the hill. Nothing at this place stays where it is put. That is the pattern, and once you have it, you see it everywhere on the site. The bluestones are set up somewhere, taken down, set up somewhere else in a different arrangement, taken down again, and set up a third time. There are pits and sockets all over the interior that belong to settings we cannot reconstruct because the next arrangement destroyed the evidence for the last one. The great ditch is dug, filled in places, recut, allowed to silt. The entrance is widened. The avenue is added, and then extended hundreds of years later in a completely different direction, down to the river. Two enormous stones are set up in the entrance, and later one of them falls, or is pushed and lies there flat, and gets a grim name from people who did not know what it was. None of it goes backwards. That is the part I would like you to carry, if you carry anything at all. This is not a building that was made, ruined, and restored. It is a building site where every generation arrived, looked at what the previous one had left, and altered it, and where nothing was ever put back the way it had been. The people who raised the Sarsens had no more idea what the 56 pits were for than we do. The people who moved the bluestones for the third time were rearranging something already ancient, and at every stage, whatever the plan was, the plan changed. Which brings us to the moment when the people doing the changing were not any longer the descendants of the people who started it. About 4,500 years ago, at roughly the moment the Sarsens were going up. A new kind of pot starts appearing in graves across Britain. It is a drinking vessel with a waist and a flared rim, decorated all over with fine impressed lines, and it is called a beaker, and it comes with a package, copper daggers, archery equipment, a particular way of burying a person, which is on the side with the knees drawn up alone in a single grave, with the goods arranged around them. Everything about that is new here. The people of the long barrows and the white ring did not bury individuals with their possessions. They burned certain of their dead and mixed the rest together into anonymous piles of sorted bone. Now, suddenly, there are single graves with named things in them: your cup, your knife, your bow. For most of the last century, the argument about the beakers was whether they represented a movement of people or only a fashion traveling faster than people do. That argument is over. When it became possible to read ancient chemistry out of the bone itself, the answer came back with an abruptness that nobody had expected. Within a few centuries of the beakers arriving, the ancestry of the population of Britain had almost entirely turned over. The descendants of the farmers who built the long barrows and dug the 56 pits are, genetically, very nearly gone from the record. What replaces them comes ultimately from the great grass plains far to the east by way of the Low Countries. We do not know how that happened, and it is worth resisting the urge to fill it in. There is no layer of burning and no mass grave. Disease is one possibility, since incoming people carry things the resident population has never met. Cattle and metal and better wheels are another, less dramatic and quite sufficient over 10 generations. But by any reading, the people standing in the stone circle at the end of that process were not the grandchildren of the people who built it. And one of them was buried 3 miles away, and he is the best furnished grave of his date anywhere in these islands. He was a man of perhaps 35 or 40, laid on his left side, with his knees drawn up, and around him were nearly 100 objects: 5 beakers, 3 copper knives, which is metal, and metal at that date in Britain is nearly unheard of, a pair of stone wrist guards of the kind an archer wears against the snap of the string, and 16 barbed and tanged flint arrowheads, a cushion stone, which is a small metalworker's anvil, meaning that this man could make copper objects, which at the time was closer to sorcery than to trade. And in the earth near his head, 2 small basket-shaped ornaments of gold, which are the oldest gold objects yet found in Britain. He had a bad leg. The kneecap had been torn off, and the joint had rotted, and he had walked on it badly for years, with the muscles wasting on that side. There was an abscess in his jaw that had eaten into the bone, and the chemistry of his teeth says that he did not grow up on chalk, or anywhere near it. He grew up somewhere cold and high, in the Alps or thereabouts, and walked to Wiltshire. A young man buried beside him shares a rare inherited quirk of the foot bones with him, so they were related, and that younger one had grown up locally. A father from the mountains, a son from the plain, in the ground within sight of the stones at the exact moment when the greatest stone-moving effort in British prehistory was ending. After the beakers, and for the next 1,000 years, the country round the stones fills up with the dead in a completely new way. Round barrows. Not the long white whalebacks of the farmers, but neat circular mounds inside their own ring ditches, and they go up in their hundreds. They do not spread evenly. They cluster along the ridges and skylines, in strings and rows, and they cluster with a clear eye on one thing. They are placed where the stone circle can be seen, and where they can be seen from it. On a clear day, the horizon in every direction from that hill was a row of white domes. Some of them are very rich. In one, a man was buried with a stone mace, a bronze axe, 2 daggers, and a lozenge of thin gold the size of a hand, worked all over with fine incised lines that had been laid on his chest. The handle of one of his daggers had been decorated with tens of thousands of gold pins, each finer than a hair set into the wood in bands, a job that would ruin a person's eyes in a few years and that must have been done by somebody very young and very good. None of these people built Stonehenge. They arrived at it. They found a 1,500-year-old monument standing on a hill made by a population that no longer existed, and they did what people do with such things. They buried their own important dead in a ring around it so as to be near it, and they left marks on it, which is where the man lying in the grass in 1953 comes back into this. Those carvings he found in the low afternoon light are Bronze Age. On the inner face of one of the great uprights there are more than 50 axe heads, cut small and shallow, blade downward, crowded over each other like a page of practice. There are others scattered on the stones around them, well over 100 in all, when the whole ring was finally scanned with lasers and every surface read at a resolution finer than the human eye can manage. And there is a dagger, blade downward at chest height, on the same stone as the biggest group of axes. The axes are a recognizable type. They are the same shape as the bronze axes buried in the barrows on the skyline all round. So the people who cut them were carving pictures of their own tools onto somebody else's monument, in the same centuries that they were burying those tools with their dead a few hundred yards away. Nobody knows what the marks were for, and I am not going to invent a reason, but there is something very recognizable in it. Somebody stands at a wall that was already impossibly old with a hammerstone in their hand and puts a small picture of the thing they own onto it. And nobody notices for 3,500 years because the sun is almost never in the right place and because it never occurs to anyone to lie down. Lying flat at the heart of the setting under the wreckage of that tallest pair, there is a stone that belongs to neither group. It is a slab, not a pillar, about 16 feet long and something over 5 tons of a greenish-gray sandstone flecked all through with mica so that a wet break in it glitters. It lies horizontally, half buried in the turf, pinned and cracked beneath the fallen upright of the great pair and its lintel, and it has lain like that for as long as anybody has been drawing the place. At some point, somebody started calling it the altar stone, which tells you a great deal about the 17th century and nothing whatever about the Bronze Age. But the name has stuck, and it is what everyone calls it. For 200 years it was assumed to be Welsh, like the blue stones, and specifically to have come from the coast of the south of Wales, which was a sensible guess based on the look of it. Then, very recently, the individual grains inside it were dated, not the rock as a whole, the tiny crystals within it, each of which carries the age of the mountains it was originally worn off. And the ages came back wrong for Wales. They came back wrong for anywhere in England. The nearest match, and it is a close one, is the sandstone of the far northeast of Scotland, up beyond the Highlands in the country facing the Northern Isles, which is somewhere in the region of 500 miles away. Nobody has any idea how it came south, and anyone who tells you they do is guessing. By sea down the whole eastern coast is the least impossible answer. What it does tell us, and this is the part that matters more than the route, is that the reach of whatever was happening on that plain was not regional and was not even southern. It ran the length of the island. Stones from the far west of Wales, stones from 15 miles north, and one slab from the top of Scotland, all brought to one shoulder of grass in Wiltshire, along with the pigs and the cattle and the people. And then, at the end of all that, the last construction anybody attempted on the site was two rings of holes that never held anything at all. They are called the Y and Z holes, and they are the reason I have kept saying all evening that this place was never finished. About 3,500 years ago, roughly 1,000 years after the Saracens went up, somebody laid out two concentric rings of pits outside the standing circle. 30 holes in the outer ring, 29 in the inner, each one a rough oblong, a few feet deep, dug into the chalk. They are not particularly well set out, the spacing wanders, and the two rings are not truly concentric with each other or with the stone circle. Some of them cut close to the standing Saracens, and some sit well out. There were antler picks in the bottoms of a few of them, which is how they are dated. And one of those picks is worn to a stub. And into those 59 holes, nothing was ever placed. Not a stone, not a post. There is no packing, no crushing on the sides, no post pipe, no stain. What is in them is silt, fine wind-blown soil that drifted in slowly, layer by layer, year after year, from the surrounding plowed and grazed ground, filling them the way an unused ashtray fills with dust. In the upper levels of that silt there is Bronze Age pottery, and then later pottery above that, dropped by people walking over ground that had gone flat and green again long before. Every explanation that has ever been offered for those holes involves something that was going to be put in them. Another ring of blue stones, rearranged again. Timber, something. And the digging was done, the antlers were worn out, the chalk was carried away, and then whatever was supposed to happen next did not happen, and the site was left, at the end of 5,000 years of work, with 59 open holes in the ground around it. There is one detail about them that I find hard to put down. The spacing of the pits appears to have been set out from the standing stones themselves. Each hole in the outer ring sits more or less radially outward from one of the 30 uprights of the Saracen circle, and each hole in the inner ring from one of the same set, which is why there are 30 in one and one fewer in the other. Since a hole that should have gone in a particular place was left out or never dug. That is a plan made by somebody standing inside the finished monument, counting, walking outward, and putting a marker down. Somebody had a scheme. The scheme survives only as its own preparation. And the likeliest guess, though it is only that, is that the blue stones were going to be moved once more. They had already been taken up and reset at least twice, possibly 3 times, over the previous 1,000 years. 2 fresh rings outside the Saracens is exactly the sort of thing that habit produces, which would mean the last plan for Stonehenge was another rearrangement of the same Welsh pillars that had been dragged across the country 1,000 years before, and that the pillars stayed exactly where they were, and the holes stayed exactly as they were dug. That is the end of prehistoric Stonehenge. Not a destruction, not an abandonment in any sudden sense, and certainly not a mystery. It is a job that stopped. And it stopped in a landscape that was changing underneath it. Through the later Bronze Age, the plain around the stones fills up with something entirely unromantic and completely decisive. Fields, long, straight boundary ditches begin to run for miles across the downs, dividing the open grazing into blocks. Regular field systems of small square plots appear, with lynches building up along their lower edges where the plow soil creeps downhill. Farms with round houses and their own little enclosures. In other words, the common ground where the pigs of half a country had been driven and eaten was measured out and divided among people who owned it. You cannot hold a gathering of thousands on land that belongs to somebody. And the barrows stop being built on the skylines, and the dead start being buried in flat cemeteries in smaller and smaller numbers, and eventually people stop marking their dead in the landscape at all for a while. The plain goes quiet. The stones are simply left standing there in the middle of somebody's pasture, with 59 silting holes around them and a fallen upright that nobody sees any reason to raise. There is a habit of talking about that as a tragedy, and I would rather not. Things stop mattering, and that is not the same as being destroyed. The people who dug those last holes had inherited a monument built by strangers to a plan they could not read, and they made an attempt at continuing it. And then their children had other work. The white chalk had gone green 1,000 years before. The purpose had gone first, and the effort followed. What happens next is 2,500 years of a very large object sitting in a field while completely different worlds pass around it. And the surprising thing, when you go through it in order, is not that it was forgotten. It is that it never quite was. The Iron Age is the quietest part of this story. For the better part of 1,000 years, from the last of the Bronze Age up to the Roman landings, the stones stand in farmland, and almost nothing is left on the ground to tell us what anybody thought of them. There is a hill fort 1.5 miles away on a spur above the river with the usual ramparts and ditches. There are farms and field systems all over the plain. There are cemeteries, and there is metalwork thrown into rivers, and there is everything you expect from Iron Age Britain, and none of it clusters round the stone circle in the way the round barrows did. The circle has stopped being the center of anything. It is a large obstacle in a field, and the plowing goes round it. That is worth saying plainly because of what people did later with the Druids, and we may as well settle that now rather than let it dangle. Druids were real. They were the priests, judges, and keepers of learning of Iron Age Britain and Gaul, and the Romans wrote about them at some length, and they were quite genuinely part of the world of the hill forts. They were also at least 1,000 years too late to have had anything whatever to do with the building of Stonehenge, and there is no evidence at all that they used it. The connection was made in the 17th and 18th centuries by antiquarians who had two facts: ancient stones and ancient priests, and joined them because there was nothing else on the table. It has been repeated ever since. It is not true, and the people who made it up were not being foolish. They were doing the best that could be done before anybody could date anything. Then the Romans arrive, and the plain becomes a corner of a province. A metalled road runs across the downs a couple of miles off. There is a small town on the river. Villas appear in the valleys, with their courtyards and their painted plaster and their underfloor heat, and the stones out on the open grass get visitors. We know because of what they dropped. There is a great deal of Roman material on that site, far more than a lonely field ought to produce. Coins in numbers from across the Roman centuries, pottery, including fine tableware, brooches. Some of it is scattered around the outside, some of it comes from the middle of the ring. There are people who read that as offerings, a shrine still working under new management, and people who read it as picnic litter, 4 centuries of tourists coming out from the town on a fine afternoon. It could easily be both, and the second is not less interesting than the first. What it is not is a forgotten sight. For 400 years, under Roman rule, people were walking out to look at those stones and leaving things behind them in the grass. There are also signs that somebody in that period dug at them. Pits and disturbances around the stone holes have Roman material in their fill. And at least one blue stone seems to have been broken up and carried off. which would make the Romans the first people we can name who came to Stonehenge specifically to take a piece of it home. They were emphatically not the last. Then Rome goes, and the villas fall in, and the language of the country changes, and the new people give the stones a name. The name is the plainest thing in this entire episode. In the Old English of the incomers, it is the hanging stones, or the stone gallows, from the word for a thing that hangs and the word for stone. That is all it means, not the temple, not the giant's ring, not anything mystical. Somebody looked at a lintel resting horizontally across the top of two uprights, saw the shape of a gallows crossbeam, and named it after the resemblance. The oldest written forms of the name come from centuries later, but the word itself is early, and it is the first name for the place in any language that has come down to us. The people who built it certainly called it something. We will never have the faintest idea what, and the Saxon centuries left one grave there. In the 1920s, in the ditch on the north side, an excavation turned up the skeleton of a young man, laid in a shallow cut, and his neck bone showed that he had been beheaded with a heavy blade, from the front, in 2 strokes. He was reburied in the museum, and the bones went missing during the war, and then turned up again decades later. And when they were finally dated, they came out at the 7th century after the Common Era, which makes him an execution burial of the kind the Saxons placed deliberately on old monuments and boundaries out of the community in view of the road. A place that had been where you brought your honored dead had become the place where you left your criminals. Then the medieval centuries, and this is where the stones acquire the story that most of Europe believed for the next 500 years. In the 12th century, a cleric writing a history of the kings of Britain, a book with a great deal more invention in it than history, explained the monument in detail. The stones, he wrote, were originally a ring in Ireland, brought there long ago from Africa by giants who valued them for the medicine in them, pour water over the stones, and wash a sick man in it, and he would be cured. A British king wanted a memorial for his slaughtered nobles, and a wise man named Merlin advised him to send an army to Ireland to fetch this particular ring, because no stronger stones existed. The army went, defeated the Irish, and could not shift a single one. Merlin then laughed at them, took the stones down with his own devices, shipped them to Britain, and set them up on the plain exactly as they had stood before. It is a wonderful piece of work, because it is wrong in a very specific and interesting way. Strip out the giants and the magician, and what you are left with is a claim that these stones came from a long way off to the west, across water, that they were already a monument standing in a ring somewhere else before they came here, that they were taken down and re-erected in the same arrangement, and that they were understood to carry healing in them, which is, allowing for the giants, a fairly accurate description of the bluestones. It is almost certainly a coincidence of the sort that happens when somebody makes up a story about a very old object. But it is a coincidence with teeth in it, and it is not the last time tonight that a piece of medieval invention will turn out to be standing next to the truth. Meanwhile, on the actual ground, the medieval plain is sheep. Enormous flocks of them moving along drove roads with a shepherd walking at the edge of them, and the wool from that country going into the great cloth trade that paid for half the churches in the west of England. The stones lean, grass grows over the fallen ones. Nobody makes any attempt at all to look after them, and nobody needs to. Because until somebody decides that a thing is worth studying, it is just where the sheep get out of the wind. In the summer of 1620, a king came out to look at the stones, and because he was a king, somebody dug a hole for him. They put it in the middle, and it went down a good way, and what came out of it is not recorded, and the hole was left. It is very likely that the digging is what loosened the tallest pair, because the ground under the great uprights is the one place on that site where you cannot afford to be curious. The same king asked his surveyor, the man who was rebuilding the architecture of England along Italian lines, to make sense of it. That surveyor measured what he could, found it too regular and too well jointed to be the work of ancient Britons, whom he regarded as savages, and concluded that it was a Roman temple, and drew a beautiful and entirely imaginary plan of it with 6 sides. That is the beginning of the study of Stonehenge, and the shape of the next 300 years is already in it. Careful measurement, honest observation. And then a conclusion arrived at by deciding in advance who was capable of what. 40 years later, a gentleman with a notebook walked the site and did something better. He noticed that the ground inside the bank had a ring of shallow dish-shaped depressions in it, evenly spaced, which nobody had remarked on before. He wrote them down. Nothing came of it for 2.5 centuries, and then, when the site was excavated in the 20th century, those depressions turned out to be the 56 pits, and they carry his name to this day. He also thought the place was built by Druids, which was wrong, and he thought it was British rather than Roman, which was right, and on balance he did the subject more good than harm. The best of the early ones came in the 1720s, and spent years on the plain in all weathers with a chain and a plane table. He was the first to see and map the avenue running northeast from the entrance. He found the great double bank across the ground to the north, decided it must be a Roman race course, and gave it the Latin name for one, which is the name it still has. He noted that the axis of the monument pointed at the solstice, and he said so in print, which nobody had done properly before. He drew the stones as they stood accurately, and those drawings are now evidence, because several of the stones he drew have moved since. He then spent his later years attaching the whole thing to Druids and to a theology of his own devising, and is remembered as much for the second half as the first. Meanwhile, the plain was being dug over by 2 gentlemen who between them opened several hundred barrows in a few seasons, working fast, keeping the metalwork and the pottery and a good deal of the gold, and recording rather less than we would like. The gold lozenge from the rich grave near the stones came out of the ground in those years. The methods are painful to read about now, but the collections survive, and a great deal of what we know about the Bronze Age of that landscape comes from them. And what was happening to the stones themselves through all this was simpler and worse. People were chipping bits off. Visitors came out from the town, and the blacksmith there rented out hammers for the purpose. And the fashionable thing to do with the stones was to knock a piece off one and take it home. That went on for the better part of 2 centuries. Add to it the ordinary business of farm carts driving between the uprights, and cattle rubbing against them, and picnics, and people climbing on the lintels to be drawn standing on top of them, and a general habit of treating the place as a large piece of free furniture belonging to nobody. The stone started coming down. On the 3rd of January in 1797, after a hard frost and then a sudden thaw that turned the chalk to porridge, one of the 5 great pairs of the inner horseshoe went over. Not the tallest one, which had lost its partner long before, but one of the pairs on the outer arm of the setting. Both uprights and their lintel came down together in one movement, and a man working nearby felt the ground shake through his feet. Nobody was under it. The 3 stones lay where they fell for the next 161 years, and every drawing, painting, and photograph of Stonehenge made in all that time shows the horseshoe with a great gap torn in the side of it. The last day of the 19th century took another. In a gale on that afternoon, an upright of the outer ring went over and brought its lintel down with it, and the noise of it carried across the fields. Which was the moment the country decided that something had better be done. What was done in 1901 was the first piece of engineering the monument had seen in 3,500 years. The tallest stone on the site, the survivor of the Great Pair, was leaning badly, and had been leaning further every decade and looked very much as if it intended to follow the others. The work was put in the hands of an engineer who had spent his career in metallurgy and mining and had a great deal of experience of moving heavy things without breaking them. They built a timber cradle round the stone and rigged winches and pulled it slowly upright, a fraction at a time over several days, with men reading plumb lines. Then they excavated its foot, and this is the part that mattered, because he dug it properly, by hand in careful layers, recording everything, which nobody had ever done there before. Out of that one hole came hammerstones by the 100, sarsen chippings, antler, and the clear evidence that the socket had been packed with rammed chalk and flint by people working with no metal at all. He set the base of the stone in a bed of concrete and left it standing straight. That work also quietly ended the free-for-all. A fence went up, and admission charge was introduced, and for the first time in 5,000 years you could not simply walk onto that hill whenever you felt like it. People were furious. There was correspondence in the newspapers about ancient rites and locked gates. And there is a small piece of me that sympathizes, and a larger piece that has seen the photographs of the hammer rentals. But the stones were still, at that point, private property. They stood on somebody's estate, they had been bought and sold with the land for centuries, and they were about to be sold again in a room full of chairs along with the fields around them. The sale was held in a hall in Salisbury on a September afternoon in 1915. The estate had come apart after 2 deaths in the family, one of them a son killed in the war a year earlier, and the whole of it was going under the hammer in lots, farms, cottages, woodland, sporting rights, and somewhere in the middle of the catalogue, the stones, with about 30 acres of downland around them. The room was full of men in dark suits with their hats on their knees, and the bidding on that particular lot did not go especially high. It went to a local man, a barrister who had grown up a few miles away, for £6,600. There is a story, repeated so often that it has become part of the furniture, that he had gone to the sale to buy a set of dining chairs and came home with a prehistoric monument, and that his wife was not pleased. The story may be true, and it may be a joke he told once that got away from him, and the man himself, when asked, gave a plainer answer, which was that he did not like the idea of a Wiltshire man not owning it. He kept it for 3 years. Then, in 1918, with the war ending, he gave it away to the nation for nothing, with a short deed and a few conditions attached, of which the sensible ones were that local people should be admitted free and that the charge for everybody else should never rise above a shilling. That last clause has aged in the way such clauses do. And what the nation had just been given was, at that moment, a monument standing in the middle of an airfield. The war had come to that plain in force. The open downs were perfect for training soldiers and better still for training pilots, and by 1917 there were hangars, workshops, hutted camps, and a landing ground laid out within a few hundred yards of the stones, and aircraft taking off past them all day. There are photographs of biplanes on the grass with the horseshoe in the background. A military road ran close by. There were plans, seriously discussed, to take the stones down and move them somewhere quieter, and other plans to leave them and build round them. It took most of the 1920s to undo. The huts came down, the concrete was broken up, the aerodrome buildings went, and a public appeal raised the money to buy the land all round the monument so that nothing else could ever be put on it. The fields were handed over to be held permanently unbuilt on, and that is why you can still see the stones sitting in open grass today rather than in the middle of an industrial estate. It was a close-run thing, and it was done by people writing letters and sending small sums of money. Alongside that, in those same years, the site was being dug. One man, an old soldier of great patience and rather old-fashioned methods, worked there season after season for the best part of a decade and excavated something like half of the whole interior. He found the 56 pits and emptied them. He found sockets, hammerstones, antlers, burnt bone in enormous quantity, and Roman coins. He was working before there was any way at all of putting a date on anything, before radiocarbon existed, before the pottery sequences were secure, and he knew it, and the results depressed him. He reburied the cremated bone from the pits in one of the pits, in sandbags, because there seemed to be nothing else to do with it, and wrote that he hoped somebody in the future would know what to do with it better than he did. They did. 90 years later, that bone was dug up again, an analyst with methods he could not have imagined, and it is the source of nearly everything I told you earlier about who was buried in the first monument and where they had grown up. He was right to keep it. It is one of the very few times in the history of archaeology that a man who apologized for his own work was proved to have done exactly the right thing. Then, in the middle of the last century, the whole subject was turned upside down by a laboratory technique. Everything living takes up a particular unstable form of carbon while it is alive and stops taking it up when it dies, after which the amount left decays at a known rate. Measure what is left in a piece of charcoal or bone or antler, and you can say, within a margin, how long ago the thing that made it stopped living. Before that, the dating of prehistory was guesswork built on the styles of pots and on the assumption that anything impressive in Britain must have been copied later, from somewhere further south and more civilized. The dates came back, and the assumption fell over. The great monuments of these islands were not derivative, and they were not late. They were older than the things they were supposed to have been copying. The white ring on the chalk turned out to be 5,000 years old, older than the pyramids of Egypt, and the sarsen setting older than the last of them, and an entire way of thinking about the ancient world in which everything worth doing radiated outward from the Mediterranean, quietly folded up. That is the world in which the man with the plate camera was lying in the grass in 1953. He and his colleagues dug there through the 1950s and into the 60s, in long trenches across the interior, and their work is the backbone of everything that has been argued about the place since. They sorted the site into phases. They established the sequence of the bluestone rearrangements. They found the empty rings of holes and confirmed that nothing had ever stood in them. They recovered antler after antler for the new dating. and they took the first cores through the packing of the sockets. They also, in the manner of the time, left a very great deal unpublished for a very long time, and the full account of those excavations did not appear until decades after the trenches were backfilled, assembled by other people out of notebooks and photographs and boxes. That is its own kind of unfinished business, and it fits the hill. And in the middle of all that digging, they decided to put a fallen thing back up. The great pair that had gone down in the thaw of 1797 had lain in the grass for 161 years. Both uprights and the lintel that had joined them lying in a heap on the southwestern side of the horseshoe, mossed over, with the turf grown up round them, drawn and painted and photographed by everybody who had ever come, until the gap in the setting was simply what Stonehenge looked like. The decision to raise them was not obvious, and it was argued about. There is a real objection to it, and it is not a small one. A ruin is a document. Every fallen stone is evidence of when and how it fell, and the moment you stand it back up, you have destroyed that evidence and created something that is neither the original monument nor an honest ruin, but a modern opinion about what the original looked like. The argument on the other side was that these particular stones were known, from the drawings and the socket, to have stood in a specific place at a specific angle, that the sockets were still there in the chalk to be excavated and read, and that a lintel lying in wet grass is a stone slowly being destroyed. They raised them, and the way they did it is the last physical scene in this story, and it happened in the cold. It was winter when they did it, in 1958, because that is when there is nobody about and the ground is hard enough to carry weight. There is frost in the grass and a flat white sky and a wind coming across the plain with nothing in it. A mobile crane has been driven up onto the turf, and its outriggers are down on balks of timber to spread the load. Timber mats are laid across the grass for the tracks. There are men in heavy overcoats and flat caps and Wellingtons standing about in the way that men do on a site where one thing is happening slowly and everybody is waiting for it. And their breath and their cigarettes are going the same direction in the wind. The sockets have already been dug out and read. That was done first, carefully, by hand, and everything in the packing recorded, because once a stone goes back into a hole, the hole is finished as a document. The slings go round the first upright where it lies. Wire rope with timber packing under it at every bearing point so that nothing bites into the sarsen. The crane takes up the slack. There is a moment, and everybody who has ever lifted anything heavy knows this moment, where the rope is tight and the stone has not moved, and the machine is simply leaning on the world. Then the turf lets go. That is the sound, not a crack, a long, soft tearing, as 161 years of root and grass and packed soil comes away from the underside of a stone that has been lying on it since before anybody present was born. And then it is in the air. It comes up slowly, black with wet moss on the underside, streaming soil, and it turns, the way anything on a single hook turns, hanging by its middle with both ends level. Two men have taglines on the low end and are walking it round, leaning back a little, hand over hand, keeping it from swinging. The stone comes over the open socket and hangs there while somebody down in the hole looks up and puts a hand out flat and moves it an inch and an inch again. Then it is lowered, foot first, into the chalk, and it goes down out of the light, and it stands. Richard Atkinson is standing on the grass a little way off with his hands in his coat pockets watching it. He has spent the best part of a decade in trenches on that hill, and he is the reason the sockets were dug properly before the crane came. And he will spend the rest of his life arguing about what the place means. And what he is looking at is a stone of some 30 tons going home into a hole that people cut with deer antler 4,500 years ago, held on a wire from a machine, while the frost stays in the grass all afternoon because the sun never gets high enough to shift it. They set it in concrete. That is honest to say, and it is another thing that was argued about afterwards. Both uprights were bedded solid, and so was the tallest stone in 1901 and several others besides at various dates, and the reason is straightforward: a stone standing in rammed chalk moves over centuries, and the whole point of the exercise was to stop this particular pair from lying down again. Then the lintel. It went up last, on the same crane, swinging slowly higher than the tops of the uprights, and came down onto them, and the mortises found the tenons that had been cut for them by somebody with a hammerstone before there was writing anywhere in these islands, and it fitted, because it had always fitted. And that afternoon, for the first time since a January thaw 161 years earlier, that doorway threw a shadow. The men gathered up the slings, the crane went off the turf on its mats. And that is where I want to leave the last piece of work on Nat Hill, because it is the whole of this story in one lift. People arriving at something old, dealing with a change that somebody else's weather made, and putting it back in a way that is not quite what it was, because a great deal was not put back, and never has been. The tallest pair is still broken. The survivor stands alone, and its partner lies cracked across in the grass at its foot, with its lintel on top of the wreck, and the long slab from the north of Scotland is still pinned underneath them where it has lain for centuries. Nobody is going to lift those, and nobody should. The Bluestones is standing wherever the last prehistoric rearrangement happened to leave them, in an order that made sense to somebody about 4,000 years ago and to nobody since. And the 59 holes that were dug outside the circle at the very end of all that work are still empty. Silted, grassed over, invisible from the path, cut into the chalk, and never filled with anything anybody intended. The last decision made about Stonehenge in prehistory was to stop, and that decision is still standing, which is why I do not think of it as a ruin. A ruin is a finished thing that came apart. That hill is a job that was put down, and it is still being read, which is the other half of it. In the last 20 years, the whole of the plain around the stones has been surveyed from the surface with instruments that see into the ground without breaking it, magnetic gradients and radar dragged back and forth across thousands of acres behind quad bikes, and the map that has come out of it is not the tidy landscape of the guidebooks. There are pits and shafts and small buried monuments everywhere. There is a ring of enormous shafts, each of them wide enough to drop a house into, buried and forgotten, laid out in a circle more than a mile across around the settlement by the river. Nobody knew it existed. It is the largest prehistoric structure of its kind in these islands, and it was under farmland the whole time. And it was found by people driving slowly up and down a field with a machine on the back. There are still things under that grass that nobody has looked at. There are boxes of bone and antler in stores, dug up by men who apologized for their methods, waiting for a technique that has not been invented yet. Every 20 years or so, somebody points an instrument at that hill that did not exist the last time, and the hill gives up something else it had been holding the whole time, and the account has to be rewritten again. Long after all of us have finished worrying about anything at all, somebody will be up there with an instrument nobody has thought of, finding out what else is in it. Go up there now on a bright afternoon in July, and it is not a lonely place, and it never was. The grass is mown. There is a path with people walking it slowly in ones and twos, and a hum of a tractor in a field a long way off, and sheep, and the larks going up one after another all afternoon exactly as they went up over the man with the plate camera. The stones are the color of a wet pavement in the shade and the color of bone where the sun is on them. And in a dry summer, if the light is low and you know where to look, the ground outside the circle shows a faint ring of paler marks in the turf, evenly spaced, going all the way round, 59 of them. The last thing anybody did. So, 5,000 years on one shoulder of English chalk. A spring that never froze and 3 pine posts on a ridge. A white ring dug with deer antler and filled with the burnt bones of people from Wales. 80 pillars dragged 150 miles. 75 great stones in the ring and the horseshoe brought 15 miles and dressed with 20 million blows and jointed together like carpentry. A sunset aimed at, a country walking its pigs across the winter downs, a new people who carved their axes on somebody else's wall, and then 2 rings of holes with nothing in them. Whatever stillness you have made for yourself tonight, keep hold of it now. Let your shoulders go down. Let your hands go loose. Let the small weight of the day go with it, the thing you did not say. The message still sitting there, the list for tomorrow. It will all keep until the morning, and most of it will be smaller by then. If this helped tonight, you might tap the like button, and you might subscribe so that the next one finds you on its own, but only if you truly enjoy what I make here, and honestly, there is no hurry about it at all. And whenever you next surface and think of it, do leave your location and your local time down in the comments below, because there is a long, quiet list of them under every one of these from every part of the world. And reading it at 4 in the morning is a genuine comfort to people who are awake and would rather not be alone about it. That is all for tonight. Let your breathing go slow and even. Let the room get further away. Close your eyes. Good night and sweet dreams.